Welcome back, everybody, to the third and final installment of our cellular respiration notes here. Today we're going to talk about anaerobic respiration, which is the respiration that happens when there's no oxygen around. Now, this is not nearly as good as just plain old normal respiration. This is sort of a plan B or a backup plan, if you will. It produces far less energy, it's more difficult to do, and it makes some hazardous byproducts that can cause some problems for you and me that you've probably already experienced in your life, whether you knew about it or not. So most larger eukaryotes, especially ourselves, only go through anaerobic respiration when we really don't have any other choices, when we need oxygen, but there just isn't any of it around. Now, this doesn't mean that we're working out in a place where there's no oxygen, like at the bottom of the ocean. What it means is that we can't get oxygen to our muscles and our cells quite fast enough. Anaerobic respiration is also known as fermentation. Now, it's used by muscle cells, it's used by bacteria, it's used by yeast. You find it all over the place. But fermentation, and we'll discuss where else you've heard that word in just a second, is just another word for the anaerobic respiration. Now, the first type we're going to talk about is lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is what you and I go through. We do lactic acid fermentation, so do any other animals, as well as several types of bacteria. Where it happens for us is in our muscle cells. If you've ever had a burn in your muscles, so you were working out really, really hard, and afterwards your muscles really ache, part of that is torn muscle fibers, but part of that is a buildup of lactic acid inside the muscles. And that lactic acid eats away your muscle. It's no fun. Now, you're more than capable of dealing with it. It's not going to hurt you in the long run, but it doesn't feel very good. So let's break it down and take a look at it. For lactic acid, glycolysis happens normally. So we have the same beginning where we have glucose, and glucose breaks up into two pyruvic acids, and those two pyruvic acids are then used to eventually make ATP. However, the problem here is that in lactic acid fermentation or any fermentation, you can't have the ATP. That step doesn't happen. You can't have it. It's not for you because we don't have any oxygen to complete this step. So instead, the cell has to try something else. And what happens is the pyruvate, instead of going to ATP, is used to make lactic acid and NAD+. Now the NAD+, that's the good stuff. That's the stuff we want to have. NAD+ can be used to make ATP. So that's great. See, for every little NAD+ that you make, every NAD+ gives us 2 ATPs. Not nearly as good as the 32 we get when we have oxidative respiration, when there is oxygen around, when it's aerobic. But it's better than nothing. Keeps the system going. However, like I said before, it also makes lactic acid. Ooh, it's no fun. We don't make lactic acid on purpose. It's just toxic waste produced by this less efficient process, the lactic acid fermentation. Now, when we use it, when we produce it, it makes our muscles hurt. But lots of other organisms that don't have muscles also produce lactic acid. For instance, bacteria make lactic acid. And when these types of bacteria are mixed with enzymes and milk, you get cheese. Cheese is basically enzymes, milk, and bacteria sweat. Bleh, kind of gross sounding. But it tastes good in the long run. Yogurt is the same thing. Soy sauce is the same thing, only instead of milk they use soybeans. And if you're German like me, every now and then you enjoy a little bit of sauerkraut, which is cabbage in the same thing. All of these can have a bit of a sour taste to them. Like Greek yogurt tastes pretty sour, soy sauce has got some sour, sauerkraut obviously does, and some raw cheeses taste sour. And that's the lactic acid up here, the lactic acid that's made as a byproduct of our fermentation. Different organisms, like say yeast for instance though, don't make lactic acid. They go through a process known as alcoholic fermentation. So So it's still fermentation, which means it's still anaerobic. We're still making energy without using oxygen, and it's still not as good as normal aerobic respiration, but it's better than nothing. So glycolysis happens as usual, just like we talked about. Only the pyruvate, instead of going to making just NAD+, which it does make, and lactic acid, it instead makes as byproducts carbon dioxide, or CO2, which we're very familiar with, and ethanol. Again, these are two things the plant, or the, pardon me, not the plant anymore, these are two things the bacteria or the yeast doesn't need, but they're a necessary byproduct of going through the fermentation. Now the carbon dioxide just bubbles away. Ethanol, however, this is also known as alcohol, the same alcohol that we drink. So when we make beer, wine, other spirits, this is where we get that alcohol from yeast. So back to the chemistry for just a second here. We got our NAD+, and we use it to make those same 2 ATPs we talked about just a second ago. It's not as good as 32, but 2 is a whole lot better than 0. Now the same process is used, as we said, for making beer, for making wine. It's also used for making bread, because those CO2 bubbles are what makes bread rise. We get bubbles in the bread, which make it light and fluffy and tasty. If you have bread that doesn't rise, it tastes more like a tortilla, which isn't bad, but it's not what we're going for. Here's the upshot of this. Anytime someone drinks an alcoholic beverage, what's really going on is, where do we get that alcohol? As a waste product of the yeast. So, kids, don't drink. It's gross. Bleh, no good. Just as a reminder, here's what we do. Glycolysis. Here's our very beginning from lecture 1. There's glucose. Glucose changes into 2 pyruvates. And that happens out in the cytoplasm. Now, if things were going right, if we had lots of oxygen, we'd go from there into the mitochondria to go through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and make those 4 and then 32 ATPs. However, if there's no oxygen, no oxygen, we have to use our next best plan, which is fermentation, also known as anaerobic respiration. If you're an animal like you or me, you go through the process of lactic acid fermentation. You never quite make those ATPs, but you do make NAD+, which are filtered to make NADHs, and we go back and forth, continue the cycle, and it makes a little bit of ATP. Just that little bit, 2 ATP there. If, however, your yeast, instead of going through the lactic acid fermentation, you go through alcoholic fermentation. Now you still make the NAD, and we still go through this cycle to make the ATP, but instead of having that lactic acid as our waste product, instead we end up getting CO2 and alcohol as our waste product. That ethanol is actually toxic to a lot of cells, which is why most cells don't do this. It's very, very bad for them. It's just the best they can do with a bad situation. And that, my friends, is the very last slide for this unit. Nicely done. Congratulations. You've gone through all 3 slides for this. You now know everything there is to know about cellular respiration. I'll see you in class.